Chapter 36. They put 4 of the unbroken jars into the blurb sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack, Zero held the shovel. I would warn you, Stanley said, I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign, then headed out. It was the hardest part of the day. Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and wished he at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach as he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but it was now destroying him from the inside. He wondered how long it would be before he, too, felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign and he continued. On looking at the big thumb, made a mental snapshot of how it looked, then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it again to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon, and if they ever reached it, he realized they still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot. To name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit and sitting in a boat while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. The 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I got to stop and rest, he said after a while to keep him up. Stanley looked at the big thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second, no longer perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade. Then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him. He looked at the shovel, but he couldn't help that. I need to dig a grave. Zero's last hole. Who will dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again flashing his thumbs up. Give me some word, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds what he meant. He smiled and said, run. Zero scowled to himself. Run. Good. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on beside his pain and weaknesses. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted. Yet, as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse as long as Zero could keep going. He could keep going too. It was possible, he thought. He hoped that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria were only in the jars which opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in his sack. That scared Stanley the most about dying. It wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. it wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of the death, he would be too weak to feel the pain. Death would be a relief. What worried him the most was the thought of parents not knowing what happened to him, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. He hated the image if it would be like for his mother and father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden could send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered if she would tell them. And when. What do you think's up there? Zero asked. Stanley looked up to the top of the victim. Oh, probably an Italian restaurant, he said. Zero managed to laugh. I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a large root beer, said Stanley. I want some ice cream sundae with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge. The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up towards it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose before them. Unlike the eastern shore, where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slow down gradually. It was as if they were walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan. Now they had to climb up out of it. They would no longer see the big thumb. The cliffs blocked their view. The cliff also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. I'm all right, he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. Let's try there, he said. It'd be a 50-foot climb. Stay up. Stanley managed to hold a sack of jars in his left hand and slowly moved up, from the ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero stayed with him somehow. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on. Others struck more than a few inches just for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 the way up on a fairly wide ledge. Zero came up alongside him. You okay? Stanley asked. Zero gave him the thumb up sign. Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. Give me a boost, said Zero, then I'll pull you up with the shovel. You won't be able to pull me up, said Stanley. Yes, I will, said Zero. Stanley cut his finger together, and Zero stepped on the intervened fingers, and he was able to lift Zero high for him to grab the protruding slab of rock. Stanley continued to help Zero from below as he pulled himself onto the ledge. Zero was getting himself situated up there. Stanley attached the sack to the shovel by poking a hole through the burlap. He handed it up to Zero. Zero first grabbed hold of the sack and then the shovel. He set the shovel so that the blade was supported by the rock slab. The wooden shaft hung towards Stanley. Okay, he said. Stanley doubted this would work. It was only one thing for him to lift Zero. It was half his weight. It was quite another for Zero to try and pull him up. Stanley grabbed hold of the shovel as he climbed up the rock wall using the sides of the rut to support him. His hand moved from one to the other, shaft up the shovel. He felt Zero's hand clasp his wrist. Now let go of the shaft with one hand and grab the top of the ledge. He gathered his strength and for a brief second seemed to defy gravity as he took a step up the wall and with Zero's help pulled himself the rest of the way over the ledge. He caught his breath. There's no way he could have done that a few months ago. He noticed a large spot of blood on his wrist. It took him a moment to realize that it was Zero's blood. Zero had deep gashes in both hands. He held on the metal blade with a shovel, keeping it in place as Stanley climbed. Zero brought his hand to his mouth and sucked up the blood. Once one of the glass jars had broken in the sack, they decided to save the pieces. Maybe they might need to make a knife or something. They rested briefly, then continued up. It was a very easy climb the rest of the way. When they reached flat ground, Stanley looked up to see the sun, a very ball balancing on top of the big thumb. God was twirling a basketball. Soon they were walking in the long, thin shadow of the thumb. "We're almost there," said Stanley. He could see the base of the mountain. Now that they were really almost there, it scared him. Big Thumb was his only hope. If it was no water, no refuge, then they had nothing, not even hope. There was a sack placed to where fine land stopped and the mountain began. The ground got steeper and steeper, and then there was no doubt they were heading up the mountain. Stanley could no longer see the Big Thumb. The slope of the mountain was in the way. They became too steep to go straight up. Instead, they zigzagged back and forth, increasing their altitude by small increments each time they changed directions. Patches of weed dotted the mountainside. They walked from one patch to other, using the weeds as footholds. As they got higher, the weeds got thicker. Many had thorns, and they had to be careful walking through them. Stanley would have liked to stop and rest, but he was afraid they'd never get started again. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going. Besides, he knew they didn't have much daylight left. As the sky darkened, bugs began appearing from the weed patches. Swarms of gauns hovered around them, attracted patches. Neither Stanley or Zero had strength to try and swat them. "How are you doing?" Zero pointed thumbs up. Then he said, "Knots of land. If Gnat lands on me, it will knock me over." Stanley gave him some words. "Bugs," he spelled. Zero concentrated hard and said, "Boogs." A wide smile across. Stanley laughed. A wide smile spread across Zero's sick and weary face as well. "Bugs," he said. "Good," said Stanley. "Remember, it's a short U if there's no E at the end, okay? This one's a hard one. How about lunch?" L-U-H, lunch. Suddenly, Zero made a horrible wrenching noise as he grasped his stomach. His real body shook violently. He threw up, emptying his stomach of the sploosh. He leaned on his knees and took several deep breaths. Straightened up and continued going. The swarm of gauns had stayed behind, preferring the contents from Zero's stomach to the sweat on the boy's face. They didn't give him any more words, thinking that he needed to save his strength. About 10-15 meters later, Zero said, "Lunch." As they climbed higher, the patches of weed grew thicker, and they had to be careful not to get their feet tangled in thorny vines. Stanley suddenly realized something. There hadn't been any wheat on the lake. Wheat and bugs. There got to be water somewhere. We must be getting close. A wide clown-like smile spread across Zero's face. He flashed the thumbs up sign, then fell. He didn't get up. Stanley bent over him. "Come on, Zero," he said. Urged. "We're getting close. Come on, Hector. Weeds and bugs. Weeds and boogs." Stanley shook him. "I already ordered your hot fudge sundae," he said. "They're making it right now." Zero said nothing. Chapter 38. Zero took hold of Zero's forearm. Stanley took hold of Zero's forearm and put him upright. He stood up, and then Zero fell over his right shoulder. He stood up, lifting Zero's worn-out body off the ground. He continued up the mountain. Zero's legs dangled in front of him. Stanley couldn't see his feet, which made it difficult to walk through the tangled patches of weeds and vines. He concentrated on one step at a time, carefully raising and setting down each foot. He thought only about each step and not the impossible task that lay before him. Higher and higher he climbed. His strength came somewhere deep inside him and also seemed to be come from outside as well. After focusing on the big thumb for so long, it was like if the rock had absorbed energy and now acted like some kind of giant magnet pulling towards him. After a while, he became aware of a foul odor. At first, he thought it came from Zero, but it seemed to be in the air, hanging heavy around him. He also noticed that the ground wasn't steep anymore. As the ground flattened, a huge stone precipitous rose ahead of him, just barely visible in the moonlight. It seemed to be grown bigger and bigger each step he took. It no longer resembled a thumb. He knew he'd never be able to climb it. Around him, the smell became stronger, the bitter smell of despair. Even if he could somehow climb the big thumb, he knew he wouldn't find water. How could there be water at the top of a giant rock? Weeds and bugs survived by an occasional rainstorm, like the one we have seen from camp. Still, he continued towards it. If nothing else, he wanted to at least reach the thumb. He never made it. His feet slipped out from under him. Zero's head knocked against the back of his shoulder as he fell and tumbled into the small muddy gully. He lay his face down into the muddy ditch. He didn't know if he'd ever get up again. He didn't know if he'd even try. Had he come all this way just to you need water to make mud? He crawled along the gully in a direction that seemed the muddiest. The ground became gloppier, the mud slashed up on the ground. Using both hands, he dug a hole in the soggy soil. It was too dark to see, but he thought he could see a tiny pool of water at the bottom of his hole. He stuck his head and lipped the dirt. He dug deeper, and he did so. Water seemed to fill the hole. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. First with his fingers, then with his tongue. He dug until he was about as deep as his arm was long. There's enough water for him to scoop with his hand and drop on Zero's face. Zero's eyes remained closed, but his tongue poked out to between his lips, searching for the droplets. Stanley dragged Zero closer to the hole. He dug, then scooped some more water and let it pour out of his hand into Zero's mouth. He continued to widen his hole, then he came across a smooth, round object. It was too smooth and too round to be a walk. He wiped the dirt off it and realized it was an onion. He bit into it without peeling. The hot, bitter juice burst into his mouth. He could feel it all the way up to his eyes. And then when he swallowed it, he felt his warmth move across his throat and his stomach. He only ate half. He gave the other half to Zero. Here, eat this. What is this? A hot fudge sundae. Chapter 39. Stanley awoke in a meadow looking at the giant rocks in tower. It layered and streaked with different shades of red, brown, and tan. It must have been over 100 feet tall. Stanley lay a while just looking at it. He didn't have the strength to get up. It felt like the inside of his mouth and throat was coated with sand. No wonder when he rolled over, he saw the hole. It was about 2.5 feet deep and over 3 feet wide. At the bottom there lay more than 2 inches of very brown water. His hand and fingers were sore from digging, especially under his fingernails. He scooped dirty water from his mouth into his mouth, then swished around, trying to filter it with his teeth. Stanley started to say something to him, but no words came out of his mouth, so he had to try again. How you doing? It hurt to talk. Not good, Zero said quietly. With great effort, he rolled over, raised himself to his knees, and crawled to the water hole. He lowered his head into it and lapped some water. He jerked back, clutched his knees to his chest, and rolled to the side. Body shook violently. Stanley thought it was going about going back to the mountain to look for the shovel so he could make the water hole deeper. Maybe that would give them cleaner water. They could use the jars as drinking glasses. But he didn't have the strength to go down, let alone make it back up again. And he didn't know where to look. He struggled to his feet. He was in a field of greenish-white flowers that seemed to expand all the way around Big Thumb. He took a breath and walked the last 50 yards to the giant persist and touched it. Tag, you're it. Then he walked back to Zero and the water hole. On the way, he picked up one of the flowers. It wasn't an actual big one big flower. He discovered instead each flower was really a tiny cluster of flowers that formed one round ball. He brought it to his mouth and spit it out. He had to spit it out. He could see part of the trail he had made the night before when he carried Zero up the mountain. If he was going to head back down to look for the shovel, he realized he should do it soon, while the trail was pressed. But he didn't want to leave Zero. He was afraid Zero might die while he was gone. Zero stayed still, lying doubled on his side. I got to tell you something, he said with a groan. Don't talk, said Stanley. Save your drink. No, listen, Zero insisted. Then he closed his eyes as he twisted with him. I'm listening, Zero whispered. I took your shoes, Zero said. Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. His shoes were on his feet. That's all right, he said. Just right now. It's all my fault. It's nobody's fault. I didn't know. That's okay. Just rest. Zero closed his eyes, but then he said again, I didn't know about the shoes. What shoes? From the shelter. It took a moment for Stanley to comprehend. Child Livingston's shoes? I'm sorry, said Zero. Stanley stared at him. It was impossible. Zero was delirious. Zero's confession seems to bring him some relief. The muscles in his face relaxed. As he drifted into sleep, Stanley softly sang him the song that he had been in his family for generations. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely. He cries to the moon, if only, if only. Chapter 40. This is the end of this video. Bye.